The heat in Blackwater Ridge, Arizona, had a physical weight to it. It pressed down on the dusty street, shimmered above the warped timber of the storefronts, and baked the very air you breathed into a fine, gritty powder. Arthur Corrigan felt it in his bones, a familiar ache that mirrored the weariness in his soul. He sat on a crate in the sliver of shade offered by the general store's awning, nursing a canteen of lukewarm water, his eyes scanning the street with a practiced, detached calm. He wasn't looking for trouble. His life had been a long, tiresome string of finding it anyway. The commotion began as a low murmur, then swelled into a chorus of angry shouts from the direction of the saloon. Arthur's posture didn't change, but his gaze sharpened. A group of men, maybe half a dozen, had spilled out onto the street. They were rough-looking ranch hands and prospectors, their faces flushed with cheap whiskey and righteous indignation. At their center, leading the charge, was Silas Croft, a man whose considerable land holdings were matched only by his bottomless well of prejudice. They had cornered a girl. She couldn't have been more than 16, her dark hair braided, her calico dress smudged with dust. An Apache girl. She stood her ground, her chin held high, but Arthur could see the terror flickering in her dark eyes, a wild animal caught in a trap. "Thieving vermin," Croft bellowed, his voice a coarse rasp. "Think you can just walk into our town and take what you please?" He held up a small, silver locket. "My late wife's, found it in her bag." The girl, Nita, shook her head, her voice barely a whisper but laced with steel. "I did not take it." Arthur rose slowly, the worn leather of his gun belt creaking in the suffocating silence that had fallen between Croft's shouts. He didn't draw his Colt. He didn't need to. He simply walked toward the mob, his steps measured and deliberate. The men turned, their drunken bravado faltering as they recognized the cold, gray eyes and the grim set of his mouth. Arthur stopped a dozen feet away, his presence a silent challenge. "That's enough, Silas," he said, his voice low and even, yet it cut through the tension like a knife. "The girl's done nothing. Let her go." Croft sneered, trying to reclaim his authority. "This ain't your concern, Corrigan. You're making a spectacle over a scared girl," Arthur stated, his gaze unwavering. "You're making it my concern." For a moment, the raw hate in Croft's eyes warred with the primal fear Arthur inspired. The fear won. With a final, venomous glare, Croft spat on the ground. "This ain't over," he snarled, not just to Arthur, but to the whole town watching. "You'll regret this." He shoved his way back toward the saloon, his cronies trailing behind like chastened dogs. Arthur watched them go, then turned his gaze to the girl. "Go on," he said softly. She gave him a quick, searching look, a mixture of gratitude and fear, before darting into an alley and disappearing. Arthur stood alone in the street, the setting sun casting a long, lonely shadow before him. He had just bought a girl's safety, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that he would soon have to pay the price. The dust of the confrontation settled, but a different kind of grit filled the air. The town's silent judgment. The next morning, as Arthur walked toward the general store, the usual nods of acknowledgement were replaced by averted gazes. Doors that were typically propped open were pulled shut as he passed. The heat felt more personal, more oppressive. Inside the store, the air was thick with unspoken hostility. Mr. Henderson, the usually garrulous proprietor, polished the counter with a grim focus, his back turned to Arthur. "Need some coffee beans and flour," Arthur said, his voice low but clear in the sudden quiet. Henderson grunted, grabbing the items without a word and slamming them on the counter. The price he quoted was a full $1 higher than it was last week. Arthur paid without comment, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on his back. As he stepped back onto the dusty street, a figure blocked his path. Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his vest, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His badge was tarnished, much like his authority. "Corrigan," he began, not meeting Arthur's eyes. "That was a damn fool thing you did yesterday." "The girl was innocent," Arthur stated flatly. "Innocent or not, you don't cross Silas Croft," Brody retorted, his voice a low, nervous rumble. "He's got half this town in his pocket. The other half is too scared to spit without his permission." He finally looked up, his eyes pleading. "I'm not telling you this as the law, Corrigan. I'm telling you as a man who wants to keep the peace. Pack your things and ride out. There's nothing for you here but trouble. I can't protect you from what's coming." The sheriff's words weren't a warning. They were a verdict. The law had already abandoned him. Arthur gave a slow, deliberate nod, the set of his jaw hardening. "Appreciate the advice, Sheriff." He walked away, leaving Brody standing in the harsh sunlight, a symbol of a town that had already chosen its side. Arthur was alone. The promise of violence from Croft now felt less like a threat and more like a prophecy. Arthur walked the dusty path back to his small adobe house on the far edge of town, the weight of 100 hostile stares pressing on his shoulders. The building was little more than a one-room shack, stark and functional, a mirror of the man who lived within. Inside, the sparse furniture was cast in the long, orange shadows of the setting sun. There was no comfort here, only shelter. And tonight, he wasn't sure it would be enough of that. He didn't waste time. He placed his newly purchased, overpriced supplies on the small wooden table. His movements were deliberate, economical. He retrieved a cleaning rod, oil, and a soft cloth, then sat down with his Colt peacemaker. The ritual was familiar, a source of grim comfort. The metallic scrape of the rod, the smooth click of the cylinder spinning back into place, these were the only sounds in the deepening twilight. Each bullet was inspected before being loaded, a small brass promise of finality. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and red. He rose and walked to the single window, peering out at the vast, indifferent desert. He wedged a small piece of wood into the frame to secure it shut, then did the same for the door, dropping a heavy bar across it. He was a prisoner in his own home, a fortress of his own making. As he turned from the door, a flicker of movement outside caught his eye. He froze, his hand instinctively going to the Colt on his hip. Through the grimy windowpane, he saw a small figure darting through the sagebrush at the edge of his property. It was Nita. She moved with a practiced silence, her eyes fixed on his house. She didn't approach the door, but instead placed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle and a water skin on a flat rock near his fence line. She gave a single, solemn nod in his direction, a gesture of profound gratitude and shared helplessness, before melting back into the shadows. Arthur waited a long moment before unbarring the door. He picked up the offering. Inside the cloth were strips of dried jerky and 2 pieces of hard corn bread. He looked towards the distant, flickering lights of Blackwater Ridge. The gift was a reminder of why he was in this predicament, but it did nothing to change it. He was still alone, and the night was just beginning. The desert night was a deceptive creature, its profound silence amplifying every tiny sound. Inside his home, Arthur sat in a wooden chair, his back to the wall, the Colt peacemaker resting heavy and cool on the table beside him. He hadn't lit the lamp. The moonlight filtering through the grimy window panes was enough, casting long, distorted shadows across the floorboards. The bread and jerky Nita had left him sat untouched. His stomach was a tight knot of anticipation. He heard it first as a faint crunch of gravel, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the skittering of a nocturnal animal. One set of boots, then another. They were clumsy, trying for stealth but unused to it. Arthur slowly picked up his pistol, the familiar weight a cold comfort in his hand. His thumb gently cocked the hammer, the soft click swallowed by the vast emptiness of the night. A rough voice whispered from just outside the front door. "You sure he's in there, Jeb?" "Saw him come back myself," another voice replied, a low growl. "Croft said to make it loud. A lesson." The doorknob rattled violently, followed by a heavy thud as a shoulder slammed against the wood. The bar Arthur had wedged in place held firm. He remained perfectly still, his breathing even and controlled. Another slam, harder this time, made the whole frame groan in protest. They were fools, announcing their every move. From the side window, a third man tried to pry at the shutter. Arthur rose silently, moving like a shadow across his own home. He stood beside the window, listening to the scraping of a knife against the wood. When the shutter suddenly gave way with a splintering crack, A face appeared in the opening, silhouetted against the starry sky. Arthur didn't hesitate. He swung the heavy barrel of his Colt in a short, brutal arc, connecting with the man's temple. There was a sickening crunch of bone and a choked gasp as the figure dropped out of sight without a sound. What was that? "Earl," the voice from the front called out, laced with sudden uncertainty. Arthur moved back to the center of the room. The assault on the door stopped. The silence that followed was more menacing than the noise had been. He could hear them whispering, their confidence shattered. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he heard the sound of them dragging their fallen comrade away, their retreat hasty and panicked. The desert reclaimed its silence, but the air in Arthur's small house was now thick with the scent of coming blood. The lesson had been delivered, but not the one Croft intended. News of the bungled night attack spread through Blackwater Ridge with the morning sun. Jed, one of Croft's men, was seen at the doctor's office, his arm in a crude sling and his face a mask of sullen anger. The town's whispers weren't of admiration for Arthur's resilience, but of a grim, expectant hunger for the reprisal they all knew was coming. The quiet gunman had poked the hornet's nest, and now the whole town was waiting to watch him get stung. At his ranch, Silas Croft was a man consumed by a cold fire of humiliation. His authority, built on fear and brute force, had been publicly challenged and found wanting. He was made to look foolish by a single, nameless drifter. This was no longer about a stolen trinket or an Apache girl. It was about reasserting his dominance in the only way he knew how. He didn't send a message. He gathered a posse. This time, it wouldn't be a handful of men skulking in the dark. It would be a dozen of his most hardened ranch hands, armed and riding in the unforgiving light of day. From his window, Arthur watched the dust cloud grow on the horizon. He had known this was coming. The quiet of the morning had been a lie, a deep breath before the plunge. He finished the last of the dried meat, and bread Nita had left him, the simple meal a stark contrast to the violence about to unfold. He checked his weapons, his movements economical and devoid of panic. He was a man cornered, the vast, open desert outside his door as much a prison as the four walls around him. Croft and his men reined in their horses just beyond Arthur's small plot of land, forming a menacing semicircle. They carried rifles, shotguns, and unlit torches. Sheriff Brody was conspicuously absent. This was a matter the town had decided to let play out on its own terms. Corrigan, Croft's voice was a raw bark that echoed in the midday heat. "Your little game is over. You've had your fun. Now you'll come out where we can see you, or we'll burn this shack to the ground and drag your corpse from the ashes." To punctuate the threat, one of his men struck a match and lit a torch. The flame seemed pale and weak in the bright sunlight, yet it held a terrifying promise. Arthur remained inside, silent, the worn stock of his rifle cool against his cheek. The siege had begun. The air inside the cabin was thick enough to chew, each breath a swallow of hot, stagnant dust. Outside, Silas Croft's voice boomed again, a final, arrogant pronouncement. "Last chance, Corrigan. Come out or we burn you out." The sharp, chemical scent of kerosene followed the threat, a promise of the fire to come. Arthur knew waiting was a death sentence, a choice between being baked alive or choked by smoke. He checked his Colt Peacemaker. 4 rounds left. Not enough for a sustained fight, but perhaps enough for a single, decisive act. He moved to the front door, his hand resting on the rough, splintered wood. There was no strategy left, no clever maneuver. There was only the will to meet his end on his feet, not on his knees. He wouldn't give Croft the satisfaction of watching him burn. With a guttural yell that tore from his raw throat, Arthur kicked the door open and plunged into the blinding sunlight. For a heartbeat, the world was a white, overexposed photograph. The mob, startled by the sudden, suicidal charge, was a blur of shocked faces. Then the world erupted in gunfire. A searing pain ripped through his shoulder, spinning him slightly. Another punched into his gut, stealing his breath and buckling his knees. But his eyes were locked on his target. Croft stood slightly apart from his men, a look of stunned disbelief on his face, his pistol half raised. Arthur's own gun was already up. He ignored the fire consuming his body, the world narrowing to the front sight of his Colt and the man at the end of it. He fired once, then again. Silas Croft staggered back, his eyes wide with a final, mortal surprise. He clutched at his chest, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his shirt. He collapsed into the dust without a sound. The posse's barrage faltered. Their leader was gone. Their certainty vanished with him. Arthur swayed on his feet, his pistol slipping from numb fingers. He tasted blood and dust. As the remaining men stared, then began to melt away in confusion and fear. He finally surrendered to the gaping wounds and fell to the unforgiving ground, the harsh Arizona sun beating down on his last, violent victory. The dust settled in the silent street. The members of Croft's posse had melted away, their thirst for violence quenched, leaving behind only the dead. Arthur Corrigan lay in the dirt, the world narrowing to a pinprick of searing light as the Arizona sun beat down. From windows and doorways, the people of Blackwater Ridge watched him die, their faces blank, before one by one they retreated into the safety of their homes, shutting their doors on the man who had disrupted their harsh peace. The town fell utterly quiet, save for the buzzing of flies. As twilight began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, shadows detached themselves from the desert scrub. Nita appeared first, her small form hesitant. She was followed by two Apache men, their faces like carved stone, their eyes taking in the scene with grim understanding. They saw Croft's body, and then they saw Arthur. They stood over him, their expressions unreadable to any townsfolk who might have been watching. One of the men, clearly a leader, spoke a few quiet words to Nita in their native tongue. She nodded, her eyes filled with a sorrow that was both deep and respectful. To them, Arthur was not just another white man. He was the warrior who had single-handedly faced their tormentor and won, even at the cost of his own life. In their culture, such a man deserved a warrior's acknowledgement. The leader knelt, drawing a sharp, clean knife. With practiced, deliberate motions, he took Arthur's scalp. It was not an act of desecration, but of finality, a stark, brutal honor marking the end of a great battle and the felling of a worthy fighter. They then lifted Arthur's body, carrying it with a quiet reverence off the main street. They laid him down inside the crude shelter of his own outhouse, a final, private resting place away from the sun and the circling vultures. Then, as silently as they had come, they vanished back into the wilderness. 3 days later, the stench finally drove Sheriff Brody from his office. He followed the smell to Corrigan's property, his boots kicking up dust. He checked the silent house first, then warily approached the outhouse. Pushing the door open, he froze. There sat Arthur Corrigan, exactly as the whispers would later describe. A grim and misunderstood monument to a town's cowardice and a warrior's misplaced honor.